It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I come from Southern California. My wife and I, who is director of our children's project, I believe she's in the first row here. I can't see out there. That's Deborah, who's mainly responsible for our success. We come from Southern California. Is there anybody here from Southern California? What district is that? I had to start off with a cheer. In Southern California, we live not far from Hollywood, and they tell us that that's where the beautiful people live. But I have news for them. The beautiful people are right here in Orlando with the Head Start people. And I feel very much at home with you. The only mistake I've made so far is I wish I had brought my cap with me. Deborah, take a note. Although I feel at home with you, I must confess, although I've been speaking publicly for a long, long time, I'm always a little nervous when I get up before a new audience. I remember once I was keynote speaker at a high school graduation, and I was pacing up and down outside the auditorium, going over in my mind what I was going to say, and this young, attractive graduating student came up to me and said, "Are you Dr. Newmark?" And I said, "Yes, I think so." She looked at me strangely and said, "Would you please do me a favor today?" And I said, "If I can, I will. What is it?" She said, "Please don't be boring." We've had so many boring speakers at this school. That's not something you want to hear when you're a little nervous anyway. Another time I was a guest speaker at a teachers conference, and I was to speak right after lunch. I was sitting at a table having my lunch, and this gentleman came up to me and he said, "Are you the speaker after lunch?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And then I held my breath, and he said, "You know, I don't know if I can stay for the whole thing. I made another appointment. Do you have anything meaningful to say today?" And I said to him, "No, I'm going to be superficial the way I usually am." In fact, my brother and I wrote a book called Happiness Through Superficiality, but I'm not here to plug this book. Anyway, it's out of print. Let me reassure you that I think what I have to say you'll find very meaningful, because I'm going to talk about what I consider one of the most serious problems facing our nation, and that is the neglect of the emotional health of our children. It's a fact that we are leaving all of our children behind emotionally. And because of this, our failure to satisfy the emotional needs of our children jeopardizes their future and the future of our nation. Let me begin by some generalizations about parenting. When I was doing interviewing for the book, I would ask parents the question, do you agree with the statement that parenting is one of the most important responsibilities anyone can have in a lifetime? Raise your hand if you agree with that statement. Are they raising their hands? Yes. The next thing I would ask, do you agree with the statement that parenting is probably the most anxiety-provoking, stressful, complex, and difficult anyone could ever have? It's more agreement than we've had in this country for 8 years. And then I asked him another question. And answer this honestly to yourself. I asked the question, how often do you and your spouse take time out and ask the question, how are we doing as parents and what could we be doing differently and better? What do you think the answer was? How often? Mostly they would say never, never. It didn't surprise me because when my son was growing up, I would never have thought to ask that question. But we must do something about that because parents we know are very busy observing kids and trying to decide what they can do better and correcting them, but we're not looking at our own behavior. And maybe this is part of the reason why that 30 years ago when I interviewed the parents and children and asked them to mention one problem they have or concern about parent-child relationship, the answers I got then are the same answers I'm getting now. After all this time, we're still facing the same problems. We can do better than that. And as the theme of this conference is to do better and to come up with things that are sustainable, as Head Start has proved to be, we're going to have to think big and think about new approaches and new themes. And that's what our project, the Children's Project, is all about. Another question I would ask parents is, how do you go about satisfying your children's emotional needs? And to that, the answer was, what needs, what are they? Think about it. Why is this important? It's important because our emotions control so many aspects of our lives. How we think, how we feel, how we behave. And all children have emotional needs. So do adults. And throughout our lives, we have those needs. And when those needs are satisfied, it provides a foundation for success in school, in family, in work, in relationships, in marriage, in health, and in life in general. That's how important it is. When those needs are not satisfied, we find that we're in trouble. What it leads to is children using drugs, dropping out of school, committing crimes, joining gangs to satisfy those essential needs. And I'm talking especially about, which I describe in this book, How to Raise Emotionally Healthy Children, which you should all have with you. The 5 needs I talk about are the need to feel respected, important, included, accepted, and secure. Do any of you have those needs? Yes, we all pretty much have those needs. And when they are not satisfied early on in life, and that's why Head Start is so important, what we find is they find a way to get them satisfied by taking drugs, by dropping out of school, by committing crimes, and by joining gangs. And that has to change, and we can be a party to that change. That's why I wrote the book, How to Raise Emotionally Healthy Children. I wanted to serve as a wake-up call, to arouse public consciousness that there is a problem, because you never hear people talk about emotional health, except maybe at Head Start. And secondly, in addition to neglecting emotional health, we undermine those needs without even knowing it. And it's not only the at-risk kids, the consequences of which I've just mentioned to you, but it's also the kids who are academically successful, who get through school okay, they graduate, and everything seems to be all right. But we find out later on when they grow up and they start drinking, and they start killing thousands of people because they're driving under the influence, and they start using drugs, and they suffer from workaholism, and they find also that they commit crimes, but we call them white-collar crimes. Well, recently we found out how horrendous white-collar crimes can be, haven't we? How many people that can affect. And then there are all the other people who suffer from depression, and the 40 million people who are being treated for emotional and mental illnesses. That's the bad news. The good news is we can do something about it. And in my book, I mentioned the 5 critical needs that we talked about, and we describe them in detail, and we describe how parents and teachers and others can create emotionally healthy environments where people relate to each other and to children in emotionally healthy ways. And in doing this, in satisfying those needs at an early age and carried on throughout life, we can develop children who turn into adults who are independent, responsible, self-confident, thinking, civic-minded, and caring. Is that the kind of person we want to develop? Yes. And that can happen if we take emotional health seriously. Now, our project has a vision, and that vision is that every parent and every teacher throughout a child's school life will be paying attention to those 5 needs. Imagine if a child went from one class to the next grade to the next grade, and all the teachers had adopted these 5 needs as a core value, and the parents were doing the same thing at home. What that might lead to, what we might be able to accomplish. Now, we've been very successful up to now in moving towards accomplishing that dream, and that leaves us to be somewhat optimistic. Although we're a small grassroots organization, my wife and I and a part-time secretary and 6 or 7 volunteers that work hard, we've sold over 330,000 copies of the book. And this happens to be to a very diverse, wide population. All cultures, all backgrounds, all religions, all age groups. And it's amazing. From breast-feeding groups that sponsored by WIC to college classes, they're using the book. They're using it by migrant workers. They're using it with incarcerated women. It's being used all over. The other thing is, in addition to being a book that's useful not only to parents and to teachers at all times, we find that there has been international interest in it. The book has been published in Hungarian, in Hebrew, in Spanish, and in Russian. And we now have contracts with Japan, India, China, and Austria. So I think we're on the way to something. And I just want to close by saying there's a universal and unifying character to these 5 needs. And one whole city in California, Salinas, California, has adopted the book. And so there we're working with hospitals, school districts, and businesses. I think over 20 hospitals now are giving the book out to all parents of newborn children. So I'd like to close now with a couple of quotes. One of them is one by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was a memo that he had written for the United Nations, but it never got delivered because he died before. And in it he said, if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all people, of all kinds, to live together and work together in the same world at peace. The second quote is from our mission statement. And in it we say, by providing positive environments where people interact with each other in ways that make everyone feel respected, important, accepted, included, and secure, we can become a powerful force for developing high-achieving and emotionally healthy children, families, and communities. And if enough of us get involved, we can change the world. And one final One final story. My son, who was in his 50s, who has never read the book and has never heard me speak until about a year ago, when he attended a meeting like this. And at the end of the meeting, I was at one end of the table signing autographs, and he was at the other end of the table selling books at cost. And a woman came up to him and said, "What's your relationship with Dr. Newmark?" And I was curious as to what he would say, so I leaned over to eavesdrop. And she says, "How does it feel to have a father who wrote a book entitled How to Raise Emotionally Healthy Children?" And without batting an eye, he said, "I wish he knew that stuff when I was growing up." So thank you. I said, thank you for inviting me here to share this stuff with you.